Do I think the liquidity created by the Treasury tapping RRP, the fund TGA and shadow bank bailouts will continue? It's a great question because I applaud you for actually thinking about the plumbing. Very few people do this, even experts. But to me, this is not a big driver of liquidity. So just so we're all on the same page here, what Brandon's talking about is you've got, I don't know what it is, a trillion, I think maybe over 2 trillion even, was in the RRP. So that's basically bank reserves that are not in the banking system. There's really 3 main components of the Fed's balance sheet, the liability side. You've got the bank reserves that are the assets of the commercial bank. We've got the TGA, which is the checking account for Janet Yellen, the Treasury. And then we've got RRP, which is reverse repo, which is really kind of a place where these money market funds kind of park their cash, for lack of a better word. So when the money market fund parks their cash there, they take those bank reserves from the banking system and move them down into reverse repo. And then when Janet Yellen wants to fill out the TGA, let's say we get the debt ceiling behind us, then she starts to issue all these T-bills. She issues 500 or 600 billion worth of T-bills, and the money market fund managers look at that and say, oh, wow, I can 10%, or excuse me, 10 basis points more than I can get reverse repo. Yeah, let me go ahead and buy those treasuries. And then what that does is moves the bank reserves from reverse repo into the TGA. Well, Janet Yellen most likely over time will spend that money. And when she does, those bank reserves go back into the banking system where they started. So that's why Brendan is talking about this additional liquidity above and beyond where we are at this point in time. Now, the reason I don't think that's a big driver, Brendan, is because the banks can create as much liquidity as they want. The banks, they don't need bank reserves to lend. So one of the biggest mistakes I see people make, even the quote-unquote experts out there, is to assume that somehow by the banks having more bank reserves, then this increases their balance sheet capacity to go ahead and lend, and then they lend to hedge fund managers, and then the hedge fund managers have that extra money, so then they go buy stocks, and then they lever up, and then the stock market goes up, and blah, 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 blah. Look, the banks, if the banks want to lend to a hedge fund manager to go buy stocks, they don't need more reserves to do that. I mean, let me just give you a couple statistics. In 1980, the amount of bank reserves in the system was 40 billion, 40 with a B. M2 money supply was 1.5 trillion. Fast forward to 2007, right before the GFC and QE and all this nonsense, the amount of bank reserves in the system was 40 billion, the exact same number. Nothing had changed. But M2 money supply went from 1.5 trillion up to 7.5 trillion, 1.5 to 7.5. And that doesn't even include the amount of dollars that increased in the Eurodollar system outside of the United States. I mean, I have no way to know for sure, but just based on global GDP and the dollar being 60, 70% of settlement, you would assume that, kind of ballpark, the amount of dollars outside the United States would be roughly equivalent to like maybe 50 or 60% of global GDP nominal. So right now, global GDP is 110, 120, something like that. So you got to figure there's 60, 70 trillion at least in dollars that have been created. How? By the Fed? By the government? By money printer go burr? No. Those dollars were created by the banks, just lending them into existence. And most of the banks and most of the dollars that were created by the banks that equal that 70 trillion were created with no reserves. None. Nada. No green pieces of paper, no reserves, nothing. You say, George, well, how on earth could they do that? Well, simple. If they had to transfer their dollar liability to another bank, then that bank would just extend them credit, or they would just draw down their account, and then boom, the transaction's settled. You don't need the Fed. You don't need green pieces of paper, nothing. You just need this global network of banks. So my point is, in 2007, let's just assume for a moment that the amount of dollars outside of the United States was 20 trillion. So you got 7.5 here. So let's just say 40 trillion combined. That's with 40 billion in bank reserves. So you got 40 trillion in dollars created with 40 billion in bank reserves. How can you look at that and say that the Fed has anything to do with liquidity? The banks create their own liquidity. Now, where the Fed comes into play is from a psychological standpoint, in my opinion. So, like, if the Fed comes in, and my good friend Lynn Alden always makes this point, in 2008 and bails out the system by doing QE, taking the toxic garbage off their balance sheet, replacing it with reserves, do they prevent the system from collapsing? Absolutely, they do. Absolutely. So in that case, liquidity is much higher than it would have been because liquidity would have dropped down to zero because the whole banking system would have imploded. You see? But that's not a result of not having enough reserves. That's a result of them making bad loans to begin with. If they wouldn't have made those bad loans to begin with, then they wouldn't have needed the Fed to come in and increase the amount of reserves. So now let's fast forward to 2023. If the market mentality, if sentiment is positive, if it's risk on, even if the Fed is reducing the size of the balance sheet, or even if the amount of reserves are decreasing, as long as the psychology is risk on, you're going to see the stock market go up. There's going to be plenty of liquidity for banks or hedge fund managers or anybody. But as soon as you see the stuff hit the fan, regardless of what the Fed does with their balance sheet for liquidity, the market's still going to go down. There's going to be no liquidity. So my point is not that the Fed doesn't matter at all, because at certain times they do, but the majority of the time they don't. The majority of the time, the real players are the global networks of banks. They are the sun in the monetary solar system, and the Fed just revolves around them. It's not vice versa. So again, to answer your question, Brendan, because it's a great question, I would say first you have to start by asking what overall market sentiment is. And if sentiment is positive, then I don't think what they're doing on the Fed's balance sheet really matters at all. Or if it's overwhelmingly positive, if it's overwhelmingly negative, then I don't think it really matters too much at all. The only thing that it matters is, I think, from a standpoint of just instilling confidence in the market. It isn't necessarily a mechanics question. It's more so a psychological question.